My name is Beverly Carter. I am 68 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. This house, appraised at $800,000, is not just walls and bricks to me. It is the reward for 4 decades of running a small bakery. Every morning I rose before the sun, kneading dough with tired hands, serving warm bread to families on their way to work. The smell of sugar and cinnamon paid the mortgage. The calluses on my palms bought the polished oak floors. Every corner holds a story of sacrifice and resilience, and I have always believed it would be the one place where I was safe. On that Saturday morning, I woke with a sense of excitement. Natalie, my daughter-in-law, was turning 35. I wanted her to feel cherished, even if her smiles for me often felt forced. I decided to make a red velvet cake layered with cream cheese frosting, the kind that took hours to prepare, but I wanted perfection. I polished the oak dining table until it gleamed like a mirror. I set out the fine china and folded napkins into careful triangles. Sunlight spilled through the windows, making the crystal vases on the sideboard sparkle. Fresh flowers filled the air with the smell of lilies and roses. I thought that maybe with enough care, she might finally see me as family. As I arranged the last plate of pastries, I thought of Randall, my only son. I raised him alone after his father passed away. Every mortgage payment, every bakery shift was for him. I hoped he would notice the effort, the quiet devotion that had carried him into adulthood. I smoothed my dress and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The wrinkles could not hide a lifetime of work, but I wanted to look radiant for Natalie. I lit candles, straightened picture frames, and waited for the sound of cars pulling into the driveway. The guests arrived first. Neighbors from the block, a few friends of Natalie I barely knew, and colleagues from Randall's firm. I greeted each with warmth, guiding them toward the table laden with shrimp cocktails, roasted vegetables, and sparkling cider. Compliments poured in about the decorations, the meal, and the cake standing tall in the center. I felt proud, almost lightheaded with relief. Perhaps this would be the day Natalie softened toward me. Perhaps Randall would see I had tried my best. When Natalie finally stepped through the door, the room shifted. She wore a crimson dress that hugged her frame, a designer bag tucked under her arm, and jewelry that glittered like sunlight on water. Her eyes roamed across the living room, the kitchen, the dining table, as if she were appraising the property. I opened my arms to greet her, but the embrace she returned was cold, mechanical. She smiled, but her words carried an edge. She mentioned how some people cling to old houses when they should be thinking of the next generation. A few guests chuckled politely. I told myself not to take it personally, but the words pierced like tiny needles. As the party moved forward, I noticed a pattern. Every time someone praised my efforts, Natalie shifted the conversation. When a neighbor admired the floral arrangements, she began talking about her new job. When a guest complimented the food, she changed the subject to remodeling projects. I kept serving, pretending not to notice, though my stomach knotted tighter with each exchange. The house, which had once felt warm, now felt like a stage for judgment. Randall arrived at Natalie's side with a glass of champagne. His eyes scanned the room in the same way hers had. He put a hand on her shoulder and then turned to the crowd. He said I had always been generous, but sometimes generosity was not enough. He said real love meant sharing, and that clinging to possessions only caused suffering. I stood frozen, a serving tray in my hands, my heart sinking as the people around us murmured in agreement. The words sounded rehearsed, almost as if this moment had been planned. The tension reached its breaking point when Natalie leaned close and whispered loud enough for others to hear that a large house like mine was wasted on one person. She said it would be a true gift for me to let Randall and her start their family here. A few of her friends nodded, their eyes darting to me with expectation. I felt the air grow heavy. My knees trembled. I tried to explain that this house was not only a building, but my entire life's work. My voice shook as I told them I had nothing else. Randall looked at me with an expression I barely recognized. He said Natalie deserved more than I did. The words echoed in the silence sharper than any blade. Before I could respond, before I could even draw a breath, he pushed me. My body hit the polished marble floor, the impact reverberating louder than the chatter that had filled the room minutes earlier. I looked up at the faces of 25 guests frozen in their places. Some looked away. Others whispered to one another. No one reached out a hand to help me. The room that had once been filled with laughter and light now felt like a cavern of betrayal. I lay there stunned, the cool marble pressing against my cheek, my heart splintered. Randall's words still rang in my ears. Natalie deserves more than you. Around me, the silence thickened. That was how the celebration ended, not with candles or song, but with the sound of my world breaking apart. I packed a suitcase in the silence of midnight. My hands shook as I folded clothes, the house still littered with half-empty glasses and the wilted flowers from the party. The laughter that had mocked me hours before still echoed in my mind. I set the suitcase by the door, called for a taxi, and stepped out without looking back. The street was dark, the air heavy, and my heart felt heavier still. The ride to Newport took hours, but it felt both endless and fleeting. I stared out the window, watching the blur of highway lights. My body was present in that cab, but my spirit was caught between disbelief and grief. I replayed Randall's face, his words, the way he pushed me as if I were nothing. I told myself it must have been a mistake, but the bruise forming on my hip whispered otherwise. Somewhere along the road, exhaustion pulled me into a haze, yet the ache in my chest kept me awake. When the taxi stopped in front of Marie's small seaside home, the world felt different. The smell of salt carried on the breeze. The sound of waves rolled steady against the shore. The sky was still dark, but there was a calmness here that I had not felt in years. Marie opened the door in her robe. Her hair tousled, her eyes widening when she saw me clutching the suitcase. She did not ask questions. She only wrapped her arms around me and whispered for me to come inside. Her kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. The warmth of her house was simple, with worn wooden chairs and curtains that swayed gently in the ocean wind. I sat at her table, numb, while she poured 2 mugs and set one in front of me. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Marie looked at me with quiet strength, as if she already knew. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her voice was steady when she said that a son who pushes his mother is no longer acting like family. I wanted to deny it, to argue that Randall was still my boy, the child I had raised with sleepless nights and aching hands. The truth clawed at me, and I fought it with every breath. My love for him was boundless, but so was the wound he had opened. I sat there, torn between loyalty and pain, staring at the steam rising from the mug, listening to the waves outside. For the first time since the humiliation, I felt a fragile comfort. The sea hummed with permanence, and Marie's words lingered like a light in the dark, a reminder that something inside me had to change. Marie set a folder on the table the next morning, her expression steady but her hands tense. I opened it to find pages of printed text messages, photographs, and notes in her handwriting. She had been watching quietly for months, recording Natalie's words and actions. There were photos of bruises I had tried to hide, screenshots of messages demanding money, and even recordings of tense conversations. My breath caught as I realized she had seen everything I had tried so hard to dismiss. Marie told me she had suspected Natalie long before the birthday party. She said the way Natalie isolated me, twisted my words, and convinced Randall to doubt me was more than unkindness. It was a plan. Each page of the folder revealed patterns of manipulation. Natalie's compliments always ended in requests. Her sympathy always ended in demands. I wanted to close the folder, to push it away, but Marie insisted I keep reading. She told me I had ignored warning signs for too long. Later that afternoon, Marie took me to meet Travis Morgan, a lawyer in Portland who specialized in elder abuse cases. His office was lined with shelves of heavy books, but his tone was direct and clear. He listened as Marie explained what she had collected, then began to review the evidence carefully. With each document, he read his expression darkened. When he finally spoke, he told me what I had feared but had not dared to admit. Natalie was not only manipulative, she had a history. Travis laid out records from Arizona. Years ago, Natalie had married an older man, a wealthy business owner. Within 2 years, he had died, and property worth hundreds of thousands had transferred into her name. There were whispers of neglect of estranged children cut out of their inheritance, but nothing had been proven. Still, the pattern was undeniable. My hands trembled as I held the papers, feeling my stomach twist. The woman who had called me selfish had been planning this long before she ever entered our family. Then Travis pressed play on a small recorder. Randall's voice filled the room. He was speaking to Natalie about how they could prove I was incompetent, how it would be easier to have me declared unfit. Hearing my son's voice, calm and deliberate, broke something inside me. The sorrow I had carried since the party turned sharp like glass underfoot. I closed my eyes, whispered to myself that if they wanted war, they would get one. My grief began to harden into something colder, a resolve I had never known I possessed. Downtown Portland felt gray and tight as I rode the elevator up to Travis Morgan's office. The hallway smelled like paper and old coffee. My palms were damp, and my ribs ached where the bruise from the fall had settled into purple. The conference room looked out over the street. Light pressed through tall windows and made the table shine. Travis stood at the head of the table with a small recorder and a neat stack of folders. Natalie arrived first, polished and bright, as if the room was a camera set. She smiled at the receptionist and then at me, as if we were friends at brunch. Randall walked in beside her with tired eyes and a jaw held too tight. Marie sat at my left and did not speak. She kept her hand near mine like an anchor on a restless boat. Travis nodded to each of us and asked that we sit. He began with a slow breath, then set the recorder in the center of the table. He said we would start with a simple review. He pressed a button, and the room filled with the sound of familiar voices. I heard Randall first, low and steady. He spoke about appointments and assessments and how easy it might be to prove that I could not manage my own home. Then I heard Natalie guiding him along with soft words that sounded like concern and felt like cold steel. Travis paused the recorder and let the silence land. He asked if anyone wished to explain what we had just heard. No one did. The air felt heavy and still. The second revelation came in paper form. Travis opened a folder and spread photos across the table. A wedding in Arizona. A man with silver hair and a generous smile. Property filings with dates that lined up too neatly with a sudden loss. He spoke in a calm voice as he turned each page. There were patterns of a contact shifts of money and a set of names that led to the same door every time. He did not accuse. He simply showed. I watched Randall read a copy of a deed with his mouth slightly open. He traced a line with his finger as if reading would change it. His eyes lifted to Natalie for a cue and found none. Natalie adjusted her bracelet and looked at the window. She said that people make assumptions that are not fair. She said that old stories do not define who we are today. Travis kept going. He brought out a brief note from a former employee of the Arizona business and a printed email from a distant relative. The words were guarded, but the meaning was clear. An older man had grown isolated. His family had been shut out. I felt a shiver run along my arms, even in that warm room. My mind tried to protect Randall with little stories. Maybe he did not know. Maybe he had never asked. The third revelation was clean and final. Travis slid 2 documents across the table toward Natalie. He said the court had approved an emergency restraining order and an immediate eviction from my property. He spoke plainly about distance in yards and the timeline for vacating. He said the orders protected me while other matters moved forward. He said enforcement would be swift. He said failure to comply would bring consequences that were not negotiable. Randall looked at the orders as if they were in a language he had never seen. He said a few broken words that did not land as sentences. I could hear his breathing grow loud and uneven. Natalie tried to reset the scene with a gentle tone. She said there had been confusion at the party. She said she had only wanted stability and fairness for a growing family. Travis did not argue. He let the papers speak and the recorder sit between us like a small, hard truth. He asked if there were any questions about the scope of the orders. Randall turned to Natalie and whispered that this could not be real. He said that the wedding in Arizona could not be what it looked like. He said that he had trusted her. Natalie kept her gaze on me and smiled in a way that made my skin prickle. She said that a good daughter-in-law simply wants what is right. She said that a large home should not be wasted on one person. Something inside me steadied. I felt my spine lift, as if a string had been pulled from the crown of my head. I folded my hands on the table and drew a quiet breath. Travis asked Natalie to confirm receipt of the orders. She picked up a pen, hesitated, and set it down with a sharp click. She said the house should be hers after everything she had endured. The words dropped like stones in a pond. The room went still again. Even the city noise outside seemed to stop at the glass. Travis marked a note and signaled to the paralegal at the door. I looked at Randall and saw a boy and a man layered in the same face. I saw the child who had clung to my apron while I pulled loaves from the oven. I saw the grown son who had pushed me to the floor while our guest stood and watched. In that overlap, I saw the truth I had avoided. He had betrayed me in full daylight. He had also been shaped and steered until his judgment bent. The ache in my chest did not ease, but it changed shape. Marie's hand found my elbow and rested there. She did not need to speak. Her presence felt like the shoreline at low tide. Travis gathered the last documents and closed the folder with care. He said that the next steps were straightforward. He said compliance was required and that any contact must go through counsel. Randall stared at the tabletop. He looked older than he had when he walked in. I watched him realize that the image of his wife had cracked and fallen in pieces he could not fit back together. Natalie reached for his arm and then stopped halfway. She set her palms flat and lifted her chin. Her poise returned like a mask placed back on a face. I stood and smoothed my jacket. My legs were steady under me. The bruise along my ribs did not define the way I carried myself. I thanked Travis for his work. My voice sounded even and real in my own ears. I felt the weight of the last weeks and also the lightness that comes when a door closes on a storm. The room held a final heavy silence. No one seemed to know what to say that would not cut the air. I nodded to Marie and turned toward the hall. As I reached the doorway, I looked back one time. Randall sat very still, his hands empty on the table. My dignity was not missing in that room. It was back on my shoulders where it had always belonged, waiting for me to claim it. 6 months passed, and life felt different in ways I had once thought impossible. I sold the old house for $820,000 and bought a small condo by the sea in Newport. It was not grand, but it was mine, and every morning the sound of waves greeted me with a steadiness that felt like healing. I filled my days with simple joys that I had long put aside. I joined a book club where laughter rose louder than the turning of pages. I picked up painting classes, my brush dipping into colors I never allowed myself to explore when life was only about duty. Once a week, I ran a free baking workshop for seniors, teaching them how to knead dough and frost cakes. The smell of warm bread filled the little community kitchen, and for the first time in years, the joy of baking returned, without the weight of survival pressing on my shoulders. On the wall of my condo hung a single key framed and centered. It was the last spare key to my old house, now polished and symbolic. I kept it as a reminder that I alone decided who entered my life, my home, and my heart. That key no longer opened a door of stone and wood. It opened a promise to myself. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was Randall. His voice carried a sadness I had not heard before. He told me that Natalie was gone and that the marriage had ended. He apologized and asked for forgiveness. I listened silent for a while, the waves rolling steady in the background. Then I told him that forgiveness might come, but it would not erase the boundaries I had built. Love without respect was no longer welcome in my life. That evening, I sat on the balcony with the sea stretched before me and the sunset burning gold across the horizon. My laptop rested on my knees as I typed a new entry for my blog Second Sunrise at 68. I wrote that family is not measured by blood, but by respect, gratitude, and peace. As the sky faded into twilight, I leaned back and whispered to myself that choosing my own well-being was not selfish. It was freedom, and it was mine at last.